Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Out of the Crisis into the Unknown. I'm Paul Michelman, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator today. Today's program is sponsored by Amazon Business. This event will be recorded, and the recording and slides will be available to all attendees approximately 3 to 4 business days after the end of the live event and via the handouts module in the GoToWebinar control panel. We welcome your questions. To submit questions, please enter them anytime in the questions module on the control panel. We'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. If you encounter audio or other difficulties during today's program, please follow the instructions in the questions module. Our speaker today is Eric McNulty. Eric is the Associate Director of Harvard's National Preparedness Leadership Initiative. He is also the co-author of You're It, Crisis Change, and How to Lead When It Matters Most. Eric, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you, Paul, and welcome to everyone who's joining us today. It's a pleasure to be with you. You know, when I was last here on an SMR webinar, we talked about 3 critical characteristics for organizations as we were surging into the beginnings of the pandemic back in March. And it was adaptive capacity, resilience, and high levels of trust. And I think that has played out consistently, and we've seen the organizations that have been able to pivot well have done best through this. Resilience is an ongoing topic, and trust is an issue that you have to have with your employees, with your customers, with all the members of your supply chain, your stakeholders. And so that has remained true, but we're also beginning to see some emerging trends, which I think are going to endure beyond, and I hate to say enduring these days because everything changes so quickly, but will endure beyond our current phase as we move into the next normal and beyond that. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I see these 3 resets that I think are going to be significant in terms of how we lead and how we manage our organizations moving forward. The first of these is around purpose. And I will say that, you know, as I have talked to organizations over these last several months and talked to individuals, people have really been focused on finding the meaning in their work. And I've been very impressed actually. This, unlike other crises, senior management teams have really grasped the human aspects of what's going on right now, how we have seen that those frontline workers truly are essential. And then the people we've relied upon, be that, you know, technicians in hospitals to the clerk at the grocery store, people we may have thought of were in a more transactional way, have been essential to the function of society as well as to the vibrancy of our businesses. And it's been good to see that. I think we have a new appreciation. And so I do see a new interest in how do we connect people to the meaning of what they're doing. And that goes beyond sort of purpose as, you know, saving the world, which again is a good thing. And we have seen a lot of altruistic behavior, people connecting to how do they help their communities, how do they help the broader society, which has been terrific. But also in terms of how significant is what I do every day and how do I serve stakeholders? I think we've seen a bit of fragility in our system and people thinking, yeah, I just don't necessarily want to go to work and grind it out every day. I want to know that what I'm doing is contributing to something that's significant. And this has been long-standing in the research on psychological satisfaction at work, the notion of meaning and significance, that people like to feel like they're engaged in an important enterprise. And so looking at how you truly are serving all your stakeholders, and I think it's not coincidental that this has been built on the emergence of stakeholder capitalism, which obviously started pre-COVID. We had the letter from the Business Roundtable about stakeholder capitalism a year or so back. We also had seen the emergence of things like conscious capitalism and higher ambition leadership and the shared value initiative, and lots of ways businesses were trying to figure out how do we actually do more than just generate profit. And one of the things I have seen emerging is this notion of usefulness. And that is how to make sure we're actually delivering value beyond creating profit. And that does not mean you're not trying to not generate profit, but it means you're working harder to understand how do we generate profit in a way that actually is useful to our stakeholders and broader society. And if you look back at a number of recent corporate crises, and I'm not going to mention companies so we don't further embarrass them, But a number of the major corporate crises over the last few years have been where people figured out how to make money without being particularly useful. They were able to bring money in, but they weren't serving their stakeholders well, and that's when they got into trouble. Because that dual lens of profitability and usefulness really focuses you on what you're delivering. It actually can create some competitive advantage that's hard to replicate because it makes you think harder and work harder at not just how do we make money, but why do we make the money? And what's the relationship with stakeholders? So that lens of usefulness and how are we truly being useful has been one. And again, it's been animating people who want to understand why their work is important, why it's meaningful, is to see that I'm actually contributing to something. And then increased engagement, and again, we've seen this goes beyond the pandemic, but the business is emerging as a driver of civil dialogue across a number of social issues. And I think this is, some of it has been public facing, but a lot of the more important work has been done within organizations. So, in the public facing piece, we all remember the sort of ill-fated attempt by Starbucks to discuss race. And, we write, let's talk about race on your coffee cup. And that didn't go very well. It was sort of an awkward attempt at this, but it's really evolved uh, in the last couple of years as we've seen these simultaneous crises around COVID, around social justice. Uh, we've had protests around the world, and we've seen that businesses have begun to create at least internal dialogues about these important issues and give people a safe forum in which to discuss how they're relevant in the workplace. So issues of gender equality, racial equality, all these social justice issues, we see companies beginning to engage in creating forum for actual dialogue. Because one of the things I think executives realized was that just because they weren't hearing these things or seeing these things doesn't mean they weren't happening. So those companies that were surprised by the Me Too movement and thought, well, I'm not hearing anything about sexual harassment, can't be happening here. Well, actually it was. You just didn't, your focus wasn't there, and that noise, that frequency didn't hit your ears in the right way. It wasn't getting up there. The same thing with race, the same thing with many other issues I think we're seeing around climate change and environmentalism as well. And so, given that governments worldwide are not doing the best job of this, let's say, at least in my view, and we've got a very polarized societies politically, business actually has a unique opportunity to engage people in dialogue. And again, this fits into that larger realm of purpose of having that conversation and having it in a civil way. We're not screaming at each other, but talking about these real issues and how do we fix it. And there's lots of data, particularly coming out of the Great Places to Work operation, showing that workplaces that are truly inclusive and welcoming for all actually outperform their peers. And so there is a business imperative here. It's not just the nice thing to do, but it's a really good thing to do. And I think we're going to see, and maybe not in this cycle, it could be too late now. I think we may see business pushing for things like election days being national holidays, or at least giving their people more time off to engage in their civic responsibilities. So, I think it's going to be a different role here, and this could be, I think, one with this really fertile ground for a lot of businesses to recover or reemphasize the importance of what they do and why they're essential to our communities. It isn't just like we do all of our good stuff as people, and oh, by the way, we have work, and oh, by the way, we have companies. They're actually an integral part of the framework and fabric of our communities. And so I think we're seeing a rediscovery of this. The second big reset is around risk. And this is where I think it's a little bit obvious here, given the pandemic and everything else we've seen, but that our understanding and appreciation of non-financial risks is on the rise. And welcome to my world. The work I do, I don't get to do a lot with financial risk, I do the financial implications of risk, but I deal in the world of wildfires and tornadoes and bombings and, yes, pandemics. And so I think what we're seeing here is, you know, climate is going to be driving a fair number of new risks, or risks we're going to be newly appreciate. Uh, recall before COVID, we were looking at Australia on fire. We were looking at massive wildfires in California, which we've seen again this year, in Portugal and other parts of Europe. So, extreme weather is going to be causing some real displacement of people and disruption of our normal operations and our normal living. Sea level rise is going to be important. We have a lot of our cities are built along the coast. That would made a lot of sense for millennia. Cities have arisen along bodies of water. Sea level rise is going to affect that. And then we've got fire, we've got droughts, we've got floods, we've got locusts. I mean, pretty much all the plagues, we've got them or are getting them. And so I think this is one that fewer and fewer people are trying to deny, and businesses and those in them are trying to say, how do we think about the risk? How do we prevent it? How do we mitigate it? And it's going to drive some different engagement with government as well, because you're going to need policy. I don't think either the public sector or the private sector can deal with this alone. It's going to require greater coordination of policy, and we've seen some of that already, where I've seen companies say, yes, please regulate. We want some clarity here. We want some uniformity across the board. We've seen a decline of social cohesion. Here in the States, we've had a lot of unrest in the streets. You have elsewhere. You've seen it in Portugal. We're just seeing it now in Nigeria. Not Portugal. We're seeing it in Hong Kong. We're seeing it now in Nigeria. Other places, there's been a breakdown of what pulls us together. And you would think a common threat like the coronavirus would unite us. That typically does. When we face a common threat, we pull together. It's an instinctual response we as humans have, is to pull together for mutual defense. But now we're not doing that, and we're pulling into separate camps. Extremism is on the rise worldwide. Different reasons or ideologies behind the extremism, but it is on the rise. And of course, and this is related to climate and this pandemic we're seeing now, we're going to see an increase in infectious diseases and their spread. That's in part because with climate change, we are seeing parts of the world warm, which makes it more hospitable to mosquito-borne illnesses, tick-borne illnesses, and we're also seeing the growth of urbanization in the developing world. So the cities that are becoming largest are places like Lagos, Nigeria, and Dhaka, Bangladesh, and other places that don't necessarily have a large established public health infrastructure, which means that when something kicks off, it spreads really quickly. And because we're so interconnected as a global society, things spread quickly. And look at the coronavirus. It came from, we thought it came from China to the U.S., which it did. That came quickly before we realized it into the U.S. But a lot of cases had come from Europe as well before anybody realized it. And so just because we have so much commerce and travel around the world, these things are going to be real issues. And you're going to have parts of the world, again, that weren't used to seeing certain diseases. They're going to become much more common. And so thinking about that and how do you deal with all of that? This relates right back to adaptive capacity that I talked about in my talk back in March, in that the better you understand the risks, the better prepared you're going to be for them, and then know how to pivot. And one of the things I've seen the organizations really at the forefront doing is approaching risk not just from a top-down perspective, where you look at your chief risk officer and his or her analysts do their horizon scanning and talking to futurists and other analysts and things and figuring that out, but also doing it bottom up, asking those frontline managers, maybe those business unit heads, country managers, those kinds of people in those positions, what's keeping you awake at night? That helps you get a very different perspective on risk. And again, our corporate risk operations have often been largely focused on either financial risk or competitive risk, not necessarily looking at some of these other factors, which were thought of as high consequence but very low frequency. But I think what we're seeing is the frequency is going up, and so are the consequences. And so you need to reorient a bit. And mining the knowledge within your organization is one good way to do that. And one particular company I've worked with, because of their global footprint, they started this, and we actually do an exercise there as part of crisis training of asking people what kept them awake at night, and we used it to build scenarios in the training. But it also helped illuminate their understanding of risk. And one of the things I recall that popped up was a concern over radicalized employees. They've been very aware of extremist groups outside the company and how would they deal with that risk, and because of where they were and keeping people safe. But they hadn't really thought about people internally who might get radicalized and might even use company assets to create an incident. And that'd be like, oh, we better start thinking about that one, and how do we make sure we're aware of what's going on, and how do we mitigate that internally? So lots of interesting things can pop up when you begin to look bottom up as well as top down. And I also think we're going to see more sector-wide or industry-wide analysis. So some of my colleagues right now are involved in something called the Aviation Public Health Initiative here in the States. And that's been an effort to bring together several of the major airlines and as well as airport operators to look at how do we rebuild public confidence in flying given the spread of COVID-19. And so these intense competitors have had to come together and try and get on the same page. And the idea behind it is that if the industry is working from a common perception and a common set of guidelines, it reassures everyone and it's good for all of them. Because if you think that one airline's safer than the other, it still raises doubts about how safe am I and how safe am I on the plane versus in the airport versus in the car to and from the airport, at the hotel, those kind of things. So this initiative and their first big report is coming out next Tuesday, is trying to bring that together. So I think we're going to see more of that across industries as well, and sort of sharing both of risk and approaches because it benefits everybody when you get that right. And then the third big reset is around resilience. And again, this was one of the topics of the original talk back in March. But what I see here is a real beginning to focus on teams. We've seen a lot of resilience as a focus on the individual. Now, again, I think of resiliency as the ability to bounce forward. I don't think there is a back, and particularly when we're looking at our businesses and our communities, we're continually moving forward. So it's not just about restoring what was, but it's about keeping people hopeful, keeping them engaged, keeping them confident that the future is going to be better. So getting them moving forward. And also understanding the multiple facets of resilience. And a lot of our work on resilience and a lot of what I've seen in the apps and the corporate initiatives is very much based on the psychological understanding of resilience, which is very important, but it uses the individual as a unit of analysis. So if I can get each person to meditate or take 10 minutes off or start a gratitude practice, that I'll make individuals more resilient and therefore will make the organization more resilient. Important components there, but you also have the built infrastructure, and this is where you look at material science and how they would approach resilience. And again, in my world, kind of folks I work with, when you ask them about resilience, they go immediately to infrastructure. That's just the way their lens on it. And so your networks, your ability to support people working from home, your ability to keep them safe in their offices and feeling safe in your offices and other facilities, that piece is important to resilience. And then environmental, and this is where being aware of climate change and how one can contribute to mitigating its impact is important, because that's about adapting, changing form to preserve function. And the better we treat our environment, the more we can mitigate the impact of severe weather, sea level rise, those kind of things. Those allay a bit of the need for us to be resilient personally. What's sort of most important is that there's emerging research that shows that it isn't by building individual resilience that you create group resilience. It's by building group resilience that you actually foster individual resilience. A lot of our resilience is based on our social ties, and having someone to call, to talk to if we've got an issue, or just to have a good relationship with. Relatedness or being part of a good team has long been seen as a key driver of psychological satisfaction at work. And so making sure we are fostering those ties and not just doing the efforts for the individuals, but we're seeing how we can bring people together right now it's primarily online, but paying attention to those relationships, the ties that bind us within the organization. And so I think we're beginning to see a greater appreciation for that. So we're going to be layering on top of the meditation app and the online yoga class and those things, ways to make sure we are fostering and building relationships, even though we are physically separated at the moment. But again, I think this has been because this pandemic has threatened all of us, we have seen a greater focus on it. Yet I also see, particularly for those people who are engaged in the actual either response to this or the crisis management aspect of it within the organization, a real beginning of burnout. And so we've got to be able to not just build individual heroes, but build a system where you can hand things off, and where somebody only does need to work 8 hours a day on this, and then pass the baton, and then to someone else who they have full confidence in, the organization has full confidence in, and you can be working around the clock 24/7. But just as you don't expect one shift to do all the work in a factory, you've got multiple shifts, and you can be able to you work on the onboarding and offboarding process really, regularly Wildfire fighters have mastered this over the years. How to do this is a lot of the backbone of many incident command systems. So you can create the handoffs that make it possible for people to be stronger longer and be thinking about that. So it's less of an individual hero mentality than more of a team mentality, and thinking about how we build that and being able to plug and play. There's a bit of cross training in there, making sure people have a sort of a social buddy and no one's left out of that, but also they can hand off jobs if necessary. If someone does get sick or is pulled away to care for a child or a parent or whatever personal need they have, that you're never covered. And one of the ways you can do this is by doing what we call a resilience narrative, which is getting very specific within within your organization, even down to your team level, is saying, a resilient accounting team is ... and then get very specific about what in your specific setting would constitute resilience. That we're never out of commission for more than 24 hours or 48 or whatever the right number is for your organization, or that everybody has at least one other person who knows how to take over their job. Get very specific, and once you've written that narrative of what it looks like, then you can begin to put the conditions in place to make it happen. You can allocate the resources, do the training, rearrange the org chart if you need to, but you can live into what resilience is going to look like. So it becomes less of an abstract concept and it becomes more concrete. Here's what we need to do to be able to preserve our function within the organization, to serve our customers, and continue to have the overall organization function. And for leaders in particular, you've got to be thinking about giving people hope. Everyone's tired, everyone's feeling worn out, and I have seen more and more leaders begin to recognize that a big part of their job is to give people hope. And to do that, you've got to be realistic. You've got to tell people, you know what, this is terrible. What we're going through right now hurts. It's awful. We've lost hundreds of thousands of people, millions of cases worldwide, people with enduring effects, kids who aren't in schools are suffering setbacks, businesses are failing. Yes, this is terrible, and we will get through it. It's good to remember that every crisis has an end. We will get there. And it's also helpful if you can reassure people that you're grateful you're going through this with them, that you appreciate them as a team. And if you have to go through this terrible time, you want to do it with them. It's good that you are together. Because every ending is a beginning. As we move out of this into our next normal, and nobody knows exactly when that's going to be. It's one of the great unknown unknowns out there. We will emerge from this. We will be doing things differently. There will be opportunities. When you look back through history, all of the great calamities like this, the plagues, the pandemics, right afterwards have been periods of great innovation and great growth. So people will come out of this. It will be a beginning. And I love this quote from Helen Keller, that hope sees the invisible, it feels the intangible, and it achieves more than you could ever think possible. It achieves the impossible. Hope will do a lot to keep your people engaged, to keep them thinking of new opportunities, to find new ways to do things, to continue to innovate, to better serve your customers, to find new ways of doing things. You'll be looking at process innovation as well as product innovation and business model innovation. There really will be a lot of energy. It's best unleashed when you can engage people in problem solving. And for people to have, when people are solving problems, that does give them hope. So make sure people are engaged. Make sure they are, again, doing meaningful work. It goes back to that purpose argument. This is all kind of a Venn diagram with a lot of overlap, but that you will keep them looking forward and keep them realizing that as bad as things are, we will come out of this. And we will come out of it, we hope, stronger and better than we went into it. We will learn our lessons along the way. We'll adapt, we'll change. And that's really going to allow you to accelerate. And again, the companies I've been talking to, many of them are thinking about how do we accelerate out of this, not just recover from this, but actually be poised to move quickly to accelerate, that they see opportunity coming. You're going to pivot into sustainable high performance, and that may mean shifting the emphasis within your business. It may mean reallocating resources. I hope that if you've had to let people go during this, and that's an economic reality we have to all face, that you've kept good relations with them. So if you have to call them back, you can do so quickly. But If you have to let them go temporarily or permanently, you're doing it with as much, letting them keep as much dignity as possible. And I think, the shift I've seen during this is where people have been sort of say, okay, we have to reduce the force here. Economics dictate we're cutting 10%, 15%, and I'm rather cold about it, and lots of, sort of mechanistic ways of doing it. I have seen now, because I think because of the common threat, and people realize it could affect any of us and all of us, uh, trying to help people move on in it with as much help as you can provide for them. Again, within the economic realities. But in some cases, that's been extending benefits. Even though someone's let go, it's been cutting people back to part-time so you can preserve more positions and give everybody some income if you couldn't support everybody full-time. It's been opening networks to people and sort of building alumni networks so that you can bring people back and or have them refer people to you when you're ready to accelerate. Everything you do in the short term should be in service of your long-term goals. It's really easy to get caught up in short-term thinking right now. Um, everything is it feels so immediate. We've got so many things right in front of our faces. The science is changing, things like daily around the coronavirus. Here in the States, we've got a big election coming up. We've got the end of the calendar year coming up, and depending on your industry, it could be the end of your fiscal year as well. We have the school year trying to start, and in different parts around the world with more success or less. And so it can feel like all you need to attend to right now is what's right in front of you. And as leaders, you've got to be able to pick your head up and look farther down the horizon and make your short-term moves in service to your long-term goals. So it shouldn't be a trade-off between the two. It's how do I do what I need to do now in a way that's going to help me with what I have to do next. And again, this is not new to COVID. Some companies have figured this out for quite some time. To keep, yes, you got to deliver your results quarter by quarter, but you want to do it in a way that is actually building value over time, building your capacity and your capability, so that you're able to achieve and outcompete for a longer period of time. And that requires that dual mindset of thinking short term and long term at the same time. Build a crisis capability within the organization, because as I mentioned earlier, with talking about risk, there are more crises coming. I think, I'm not a professional futurist, but looking at the broad picture of things, I think we're clearly transitioning out of that relative stability of post-World War II global order, and we're moving into a period of relative turbulence. I think we are going to see, we're looking at with climate, large numbers of climate refugees, which is going to have a geopolitical impact. We are looking at obviously the direct impact of climate change in terms of weather and sea level rise and those kind of things, the growth of disease. We are seeing lots of bubbling. I should have a better way to put it, but lots of bubbling on the surface here that I think is going to keep us roiling for some time. So be thinking about how do you build that crisis capability within your organization. Have crisis teams, have the protocol set up, the processes. Really, it should go from being just business continuity, which too often gets pushed way down in terms of importance, and it's of a function you have to have, and it's way down the operational chain of command, up into something that's a core competency for the organization. Because the better you can do it, the fewer crises you're going to have to treat as crises. They may be local emergencies, they may be disruptions, but you'll be able to handle them much more smoothly. And so I think building that capacity with organizations is going to become a new priority. And again, a way to drive additional insight into the risks you're facing, the opportunities you may be able to see, the ways to build new relationships throughout your supply chain and with your customers, if there are places where you have to do this together or do it in synchrony. And so I think it's actually a great business opportunity to build that crisis capability within organizations. And then again, people need to develop a much greater sensitivity to what's happening, and what changes matter and which changes don't. So if you think about, every strategy I've ever seen, no matter what framework you use to come up with it or what model you use to come up with it, could be boiled down to three basic elements. There are some assumptions you make about your capacity, the market, the economy, competitors, whatever, but you make a set of assumptions. You set an objective, be that revenue, market share, new products introduced, again, whatever your goals happen to be, and then you craft a pathway to get there. And that's your strategy. You align your organization around it, you set your incentives around it, your priorities, and those three basic pieces make up what's going to happen. So when you get a disruption like this one, what you need to go back and say, okay, which of our assumptions are still valid? Which ones do we need to revisit? Is that objective still viable? Is that where we want to go, or do we want to go somewhere different? And then is our pathway still clear, or is it strewn with rubble from all the various disruptions we've had? If we get potholes, do we have to pick a new pathway to get there? And so I think you continue to be looking at those three pieces of things, because if you're only looking at the pathway, but you're not realizing that some of the underlying assumptions have changed, you're going to wind up off course. And if you aren't looking at where that objective is and how it may need to shift, and again, we can sometimes get really focused, say, well, we're going to make that goal no matter what. Well, maybe that goal needs to change. And it doesn't mean anything that's short is smaller, but it may shift from we're going to make the money in this marketplace to, you know what, there's a better opportunity in that marketplace. We're going to shrink part of the business and grow a different part of the business. We may be jettisoning a legacy business and starting something new, but be looking at those components to see what's changed, what's not, and that will help you identify where the real opportunities are. It'll also help you avoid some of the risks, but create that sensitivity, be able to get the information bubbling up from the very front lines of the organization all the way up. So you're getting those distant signals, those faint signals on the horizon. You can begin to recognize them earlier so that you can make the appropriate moves to mitigate them, mitigate the risk, and then seize the opportunity. And through it all, you're it. So you on this call, those of you who others in your organization you share this with, you're going to have to make the choices that are going to move you forward. You're going to have to be the ones that keep people hopeful, that re-identify and emphasize that purpose, how you're being useful in the marketplace. Help people understand risk. Where is it? How severe is it? How do you prevent it or mitigate it? And then, how do you actually build that sustainable high performance that marks a truly resilient organization? One that can go through adversity knowing it's at its best. Now, even when it's at its most challenged, you're performing at your best, and that you are truly a valuable part of your community, not just your value chain, and that you are an indispensable part of this larger fabric of society. And with that, I look forward to hearing your questions and Paul's as well. So I'm going to turn off my screen share and I'm going to turn on my webcam.
Eric, thank you very much. Great to see you now that we have heard you. There is a lot to chew on in that presentation, and we already have many questions coming in. So let's dive right in, shall we? I want to begin with a series of questions about leadership and the role of leaders, both through this turbulent time and coming out of it. It's one thing to accept for yourself that there is no return to our legacy conception of normal, and that we are bound and bounding into this turbulent period of frequent disruption that you and others have described. Okay, some of us may be able to internalize that, begin to have some sense of acceptance of that. But how do you even begin to prepare an organization full of human beings to accept that reality?
It is a real challenge, and you're right. And we don't, some parts of our legacy operations and organizations will endure. Not everything is going to change. That said, I think what you need to be able to do or begin to do is to prepare people with general skills as well as specialist skills. And so I think a lot of what I've seen in organizations is in terms of both hiring, but then in development and promotion of people, they get into these specialized niches, and you support their continued advancement and deepening knowledge within the specialty. If you can also add to that some more generalist skills and thinking, so around things, be it around design thinking or leadership or conflict resolution, you begin to prepare them to shift roles so they can maybe move from one specialty to another. You may pick somebody out of accounting and they wind up in a business unit where all that knowledge of the numbers is going to come in handy, but they aren't necessarily being an accountant anymore, but you've given them the more general set of skills to be able to move within the organization. So I think thinking about people, again, this is if you want to develop a workforce that is with you for a long period of time, that is, you're building them to change, not just stay the same and go deeper into where they were. So that's one piece of what I would do. And I think the usefulness argument here is a good one as well, in that if our focus is being useful to our customers, those customers' needs are going to change, and therefore we are going to continually change as well. And so stasis is not the norm, but change is the norm. And we're going to try and, as an organization, to be as agile, and that's in the lowercase agile, not the capital A agile. But we're going to be as agile and as swift and coordinated as we can be in doing that. And if that becomes the mindset of the organization, having to change is not as surprising as it has been in the past.
That's a really good kind of operational answer to my question. And
Yep.
now let's look at the more personal side of this. Let's talk about hope, something that you
Mhm.
referenced in the presentation. As a leader, how do you inspire hope at a time like this? If you maybe feeling a certain lack of or hopelessness yourself.
It is. I mean, and this is part of, as a leader, needing to be true to yourself, but also being the leader people need you to be. And so and you look back at examples through history. Abraham Lincoln here in the States, Winston Churchill in the UK. We've had great leaders during tremendous adversity who, yes, behind closed doors felt pretty hopeless or pretty worn down, but knew they had to express hopefulness to those who they wanted to follow them, if those people were going to continue to follow them. And so I think it does help to realize that there will be opportunity at the far side of this, and then engage yourself in trying to figure out what that is, because we will endure here, and I think it is a matter of opening yourself up to new voices, to new experiences, to see where that may come from. And I think also making room for conversation, I think, within the organization. This is part of it, of having people actually talk about this, and finding forums. Again, it's hard to do the town hall. It can't be in person anymore. And this hopefulness piece is much easier when we're in person, when we can actually experience that human energy. Um, but talking about where the bright spots are, where you think the bright spots are going to be, helps with that. We are seeing some flickers of renewed demand for X. And so here's where we're refocusing resources here, as we're going to invest in some experimentation, et cetera, because we think we're going to come out of this better. And then I think there are, and I wish I could remember who said this to me, because I'm going to steal the phrase. Um, I think it's a good one, is having what this person called with random acts of leadership, which is start initiating contact with people at different levels of the organization with whom, if you're at a senior level, you might not normally interact. Finding ways to have that casual conversation, or just tell me what's going on in your unit or in this office, and be in contact with people and hear what they have to say. That also gives people hope. If they realize they're being heard by people farther up in the organization, at least understand the difficulty they're going through and the questions they have, that gives them hope as well. So making yourself more visible. I mean, I think one of the primary jobs of a leader is to show up. And so you've got to be showing up, showing yourself, and be willing to take the tough questions. And then, there's amazing energy and spirit of the people who are in organizations, and you just got to be able to help surface that and bring it forward, and you will find hope emerging.
It's never been harder to show up, right? We'll put that word in quotes than it is today.
Yes.
So what are some techniques or tools that you've seen that really work for engendering hope and building trust in this physically distanced world?
Interestingly, I've seen getting off Zoom and getting onto the telephone, the old-fashioned thing. I have seeing people using that, the quick phone call, like stop texting. um, but the voice is very reassuring. And actually, I think the fact that it's a bit older technology also gives people a bit of reassurance. And it takes away some of the stress of having to constantly be looking, and because this is very cognitive. Zoom and other platforms like this are very cognitively stressing on us. So that certainly has been one thing. The other has been uh, handwritten notes. Again, sort of going back to older, more analog technologies in a way of writing a short note. And this may, like, the CEO is not going to write 20,000 notes, but to your team, sending somebody, it could be a birthday card, it could just be a, hey, thanks for hanging in here, thanks for being part of this. But where you can express it's a very authentic way of expressing your gratitude. It takes a little bit of time, but that certainly has worked. And then I think at a larger level um, has been uh, the I'm trying to get the right way to put this, but to as part of goes back to the sort of creating the spaces for conversation has been opening up to say we know something is going on here in the case of it being most recently sort of racial stuff that we want to have this conversation and let's create let's have that, and you get to model that you're willing to listen to it and hear it and maybe have an interview with someone to start it off, but then be willing to hear that tough stuff, however, whatever platform works best in your organization. Again, it communicates authenticity, and that's part of kind of connection and ultimately giving people hope when they feel like you're actually talking to real people and not just boxes on an org chart.
So on that note, let's talk about empathy for a minute, a word that's being used perhaps more frequently than ever when it comes to the role of leadership right now. I'm not always sure we're talking about the same thing when we talk about empathy. So what is your definition of empathy, and what are some particularly effective ways of expressing it that you've observed?
You're right. I mean, empathy is the new resilience, in terms of buzzword popularity. Um, and I always think of empathy as the ability not just to cognitively understand someone else's experience, but to actually to feel it, to be able to really identify with it. And that does require, I think, opening yourself and getting and seeing new experiences, listening to new voices as a way to build that. Um, there was an incredibly powerful program on National Public Radio yesterday here in the States, and you get it online anywhere on the program called On Point that's broadcast out of Boston. And they've been doing a series of voter roundtables every Wednesday. And yesterday's was 3 people on who talked about who were directly affected by COVID-19. And this was an hour where 3 people told their stories. One had lost his wife. I'm forgetting the exact circumstances. The other 2, I apologize for that. But they're 3, and all of them were living riveting stories. And I think taking the time to listen for that period of time, and if it could be, say, a podcast or a radio show, or it could be a real person having them tell their story, to what it really means, what it really felt like to have that loved one in the hospital when you couldn't be there, or you could only be there for a few minutes to hold a hand, but you couldn't give them a farewell kiss. That opens you up to a different level of feeling. So it's taking away from the abstract statistics and things. And so I think it is an amazing opportunity right now because there's been so much available online to sort of be able to step into different experiences. And so I think it's a matter of constantly making sure you're getting out of your bubble. And the more senior we get in organizations, the tighter that bubble gets, and people filter our information and they really try to control what we get and what we don't get. That's helping us be more efficient. Is to constantly push out of that and listen to different voices and be that so someone in your organization you've never spoken with who can tell you that story, or taking the time if you know someone who's been affected by be it any aspect of the various crises we're going through right now, to really take the time to listen. That to me is how you build empathy and how you begin to understand what they're going through.
One of the questions that I think that I've seen leaders wrestle with, that I myself have wrestled with, and other people in my organization have, is what people in the organization are actually seeking when they are seeking greater empathy. My interpretation is that they're seeking both a both a listening ear and attempted understanding, but also action.
Yes,
Do you think that's accurate?
absolutely, that's accurate. Um, you're right. Listening is the first step, and you've got to do that to actually hear what people are saying. But then, yes, taking action on it to make sure that you are addressing some of what their stresses are. If you are helping them mitigate some of that, and again, that may be something as simple as, you know, no emails after 6 o'clock, because we know you're all an overloaded home now, having to do homeschooling and everything else. So and yeah, and you have to actually live by that. But physically creating things. I remember, and Paul, you and I have both been in publishing, but back in the good old days, in the summer, in New York, every office closed at 1 o'clock. It was summer hours. Um, that kind of thing of saying, you know what, we're going to work a 4.5 day work week just because I know you need time to get rid of some stress and do some stuff. So if that's what people are asking for, if they are asking for more, be it training or the online yoga class, whatever it is, begin to give them some of that. And you can't fulfill every wish for sure, but if you start to take some action based on what you've heard, it reinforces the fact that you're listening, and it also actually helps meet some specific needs.
Thank you.
And I will say, I would tell you one quick story there before you move on. This is pre-COVID, but one of my colleagues, Rich Serino, who was #2 guy at FEMA, so he had a workforce of about 200,000 people. And one of the first things he did when he took the job was he visited every one of their regional offices. There are 10 regions, which is something somebody his level had never done, and spent a good chunk of his day walking around talking to people in their cubicles and asking them, why did you join the organization? What motivates you? And what can we do better? And he did that. And again, people thought, okay, just wow, somebody's walking around listening, but that's never going to go anywhere. Um, and then he did see some themes in what people were asking about, and then began to take action. He said that spread like wildfire through the organization, and it really improved morale. So that kind of thing is really important to take the action. Sorry, go ahead.
No, thank you. I'm glad you added to that answer. I'm going to shift to some other topics within this topic. You referenced the Business Roundtable near the beginning of the presentation, and we have a couple of questions related to that. What signs give us hope that the call from the Business Roundtable to repurpose the corporation is anything more than lip service?
Um, Very good question, and I think in some cases anywhere, there's been more heat than light out of that, for sure. That said, um, I think that there's two things there. One is, and I've been dying to have a graduate student volunteer do this, and I've yet to find one who can do it. So maybe someone on the call can join this. Is if you actually looked at all the companies who have committed to one variant of this or another, and kind of did a big heat map of them to see. I think it's actually a lot more organizations really starting down this path than we realized, because it is fragmented into these different sort of substrands of activity. But the other thing is that it may take a little time, but once people start saying this stuff, eventually they have to live into it a bit. It can't just be the thing in the front of your annual report and then you take no action. And so some will be slower than others, but I think that you do eventually begin to have to live into this in some way, because your people hold you accountable, and the ability to attract new talent is increasingly seems to be dependent upon that, from what I've read. Your regulators begin to hold you accountable for that as well. And I think also some organizations begin to see regulatory advantage in being at the forefront of doing this, and so that pushes them strong as well. It pushes them along as well. I do think it's been halting, but I do think we actually are getting progress is being made. I just think it's not being documented quite as well as it might be. And I do see more and more of it.
Thank you. Here's a question regarding kind of smaller organizations. And, Sloan Management Review has many readers, and I'm sure many people in our audience today, aren't in Fortune 500 or Global 5,000 organizations. And I think small and mid-sized enterprises, and I'm quoting one of our audience members today, in particular, have a very tough time during this crisis, And then also related to kind of longer ongoing crises, the types of things you've mentioned, particularly climate. What can smaller organizations do to prepare and respond for this period of disruption, climate and otherwise? They don't have the same kinds of resources available as larger organizations.
Um, no, they don't, but that also they can be more nimble than large organizations can be because you've got fewer committees and fewer levels of bureaucracy. And so I would think I would be very much starting local. I mean, if you are a small and medium-sized enterprise, look at what's right around you and see where you can engage on this and prepare on this. I also think that, in terms of the sort of crisis capability, look at where you can overlay that with things that benefit the business as a whole during routine time. So, for example, you may want to start having your more of your employees get certified in first aid. I'm just pulling one out of the air there. That actually will help your community and helps you be better prepared for a whole range of emergencies. And if something bad happens at work, you got lots of people. You got people there who can prepare, and then also you build a new skill for them as well. But begin to sort of overlay and being able to contact people in an emergency. Think about through how you would do that, which again helps you stay more in touch with employees. It doesn't have to be a fancy system you buy. It could be a simple phone tree like you use for the kids' soccer league. But be thinking about that. So there's ways you can begin to respond to these things, and making conscious choices again at the local level of the products you're bringing into your facility. What are they made of? Where do they come from in terms of their environmental impact? How can you begin to advance this? And it's a great brand new documentary just came out on the journey of Interface, the commercial carpet company, which was not that big actually, and was in a fair amount of financial trouble a couple of points along their journey, but committed to addressing the environment and going to now they were committed to going carbon negative, not just neutral, but carbon negative. And you look at them, and they're not a small company, but not a huge company. How that drove innovation, how it drove employee engagement and real commitment among customers. And so I think there's one example you could look at. It's don't try and boil the ocean. Actually, with global warming, definitely don't try and boil the ocean. Don't try and tackle the whole thing, but look at the smaller steps you can take. And say again, you're more agile, so there could be ways you can engage with your local community. There are lots of groups and organizations who would love to have more private sector involvement.
Great. Let's spend some time now talking about resilience, a very important theme in your work and certainly an area of great interest for our audience. So I'm going to ask you a question now, which is going to be impossibly complicated, but I'm trying to bring together a number of different themes that our audience is interested in. You mentioned resilience at several different levels of the organization, and people have added to that. I think what we're interested in understanding is the relationship between resilience at the individual level, the team level, kind of interdepartmental level, and the organizational level. Is it possible to speak to that in some cogent way?
I will try, and it's an incredibly complicated topic, and it's a word that's used a lot. And when I mentioned those three different examples of the individual, there's a psychological, built environment, and environmental. Those are three separate disciplines in the academic world who never talk to each other, right? I mean, so actually people do spend entire careers looking at one slice of this and not the whole thing. But I think that it is for leaders and organizations, you start with looking at it at a holistic level. And I think seeing where can we contribute to our ability to sustain ourselves. You have a lot of control over the built environment, sort of what your facilities look like, what your systems look like, that piece of things. How do you support people individually? But I think that looking at the social bonds and making sure that you have a strong social connections in the organization is the place where organizations can have incredible impact that goes beyond the individual piece. I said, I know people in HR in particular is getting barraged with offerings from different companies that have apps and different things, which I've seen several of them and all quite good at the individual level. But you got to really how do we foster relationships? How do we not even break down silos, but connect the silos in intelligent ways and look to build that culture where we take care of each other. That to me is a big one, because at the tone of we take care of each other and we take care of our community. I remember back from the 2017, we had the Hurricane Harvey down in Texas, and then the other hurricane that followed. One of the big energy companies I work with was affected in Houston. They had a couple of facilities flood. They had quite a number of employees whose homes were affected pretty significantly. And without anybody asking, their employees created a shelter at one of their facilities that was not flooded. It was initially for their employees' families, and then they began to work with other people in the neighborhood as well. But because they had this attitude of and this culture of, we respond well. They have great crisis capability, but we respond well. We take care of people. That's their number one rule. People were coming in, they were volunteering, they set up a shelter, they organized it, they had a kids' room with activities, they really took care of this, all self-organized. And it was because that initial culture was, we get through tough times, we take care of each other, we take care of people. And so I think that if organizations can set that tone, and then go to the individual piece and see what individuals need. So flip it over as a way, I think it's the best place to start addressing that. And when you address it at the cultural level, then it goes across the organization.
Can you have that? Is that unique to a crisis? I guess this is a cynical question. The expression, not just the expression of, we care about our people and we put the needs of our people before all other things. People are prone naturally to make expressions like that in light of great crisis, right? And also much more likely to be able and willing to follow through during a time of crisis. Have you seen organizations actually sustain that?
Yes, actually I have. And again, I don't want to spend too much time on at that one energy company, but I've spent a lot of time with them. It does permeate every day in their organization, and it's because they actually take health and safety very seriously. So they worry about not just on-the-job injuries, but heart disease and other things that affect the workforce and their families. They've also extended it to their family members and said, how do we affect that there? They really got serious about how do we make the workforce healthier. Was a way to do that. But also, there's another large office supply company, wholesaler, that one of the things they did that I think built some of the same characteristics in a very different way was took their corporate foundation and decentralized it. And so now at their different regional operations, they had, yes, a certain amount of money they could spend, but they locally figured out how to do it and what they were going to do. And there was volunteers within the organization who got to do that. But one of the rules around this was it had to involve your hands and not just your heart. So it wasn't just writing a check, but you actually had to be doing something. And so one region was building bicycles for kids that were in underserved communities. They wanted a whole thing about, because their office supplies, stuffing and creating backpacks for schools. And in a way, that gave people a way to build those social bonds. It built all of a sudden the hierarchy went away, because when you're stuffing backpacks, you've got the warehouse worker sitting next to a vice president, both doing the same job. And so it created a culture of, we're all in this together. We're helping our community. We have pro-social activities, and it took away some of the hierarchy that can sometimes get in the way of people actually taking care of each other. So I think if you get creative around it, there are multiple opportunities to be able to do it.
So last question, for which I'm giving you far too little time to answer, but that's the way things go. What is your work, not just over the past year or close to year, but in the time that you have been studying preparedness leadership and crisis leadership, what does it suggest about the types of traits we should be seeking in our leaders going forward in this more turbulent world? And I'm talking about backgrounds, personality traits, characteristics. What have we been missing that we need more of?
I think we need more curiosity, more openness to surprise, and surprise as a source of inspiration. And I think more generalists. I think we've done a lot of teaching people all the right business skills coming through MBA programs. We need to teach people to, or find people who are art lovers and opera lovers and explorers on the weekend, and who actually have a much more well-rounded existence beyond just their jobs. Because that opens you up to seeing a lot more of the world and understanding where these risks and opportunities could come from. And it also opens you up to connecting more deeply with all the people in your organization and beyond it.
Great. Eric, I know you have a lot more to say on that topic, so I apologize. We are at the top of our hour, and our program needs to come to an end. I will look forward to continuing this conversation with you. Folks, thank you so much for joining us today and for all of your wonderful questions. I'm sorry we only got to a relatively small portion of them. Over the next few days, please look for a survey that'll be coming via email. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. This concludes our program. Thank you for attending. Thank you, Eric McNulty, and thank you to our sponsor, Amazon Business. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you.